be. Maybe it's that way. All right. Good to see you. Glad that you're here this morning. If you're visiting with us, thank you for visiting with us. It's going to be a good day. I believe that God's got a word for you this morning. And maybe you don't want the word. Maybe I didn't want the word either. But this morning, I think we have a word. I don't know that I've ever preached much on Judas. He's not really a popular person in the Bible that we like to talk about. Other than maybe I've briefly mentioned him in the betrayal of Jesus. But the thing is, when you look back on his life, he was spiraling down a pathway that ultimately took his life. And for some time before, he was spiraling down this pathway before he actually met the end of his life. And he had an opportunity to turn it around. But when we look at his behavior, he was living for himself and choosing not to be guided by the Lord. The steps today that we're going to look into about Judas is, number one, Judas was stealing from the money bag. We'll see that. You'll see a portion of Scripture where it talks about Satan entered Judas because he left this door of his life open. You'll also see today where Judas' betrayal of Jesus, where he takes 30 pieces of silver to hand over Jesus. And then you'll see the end game, which was Judas hangs himself. But I want you to think about this too. From the outside looking in, and from the inside looking out, Judas looks the part. I mean, he was one of the top 12. He was sleeping next to Jesus. He was listening to Jesus teaching. You would think it would be really easy to believe in Jesus if he was literally standing right in front of you. You were seeing his facial expressions. You were seeing his hand movements. You would think, man, that you would be getting the very best you could possibly get throughout history. So Judas looks the part. He's present for the miracles. Today, we don't see miracles a lot of times in the way that they were seeing them in. They were seeing them right at the hands of Jesus as he was performing them. And we may see miracles from time to time, but we don't see them in the way that Jesus, like we didn't see Jesus turn the water to wine, but Judas was there. He heard Jesus' teachings firsthand. He knew Jesus' heart because, you know what, he had spent much time with him. Brett and I are friends. I kind of know the things that are on Brett's heart about ministry. Why? Because we spend time, we're in communication with one another. Judas is this way with Jesus. He saw Jesus' face. He knew Jesus' expressions as he told stories and taught lessons. Have you ever seen someone tell a story and it's hard for them and you could see it on their face? Maybe they were recounting a time when they were in war. They were recalling a time that they were in battle, and you could see the hurt on their face. Judas is seeing Jesus' heart through the facial expressions that he makes, because Jesus' heart for people is so deep, and Judas is seeing it firsthand, but somehow Judas misses the mark. And this morning, maybe you will see yourself in the same light. Maybe you're in all the right places. You speak the lingo, but you love yourself more than you love Jesus. And this, I'll be honest, it's a difficult word. The disciples could have seen that Judas would betray Jesus beforehand, but there were signs. People always say hindsight's 20/20. Often when we look back, we clearly see things that should have told us all that we needed to know about a situation. People will say, well, that person, yeah, they were quiet, but I never would have expected this, or this person was a loner, and now all of this bad stuff is happening. And if I look back, yeah, maybe there were signs there that something bad was going to happen. And when John, the disciple, is looking back in John chapter 12, which is where we're about to go, he's recalling things about Judas that there were signs that he wasn't faithful to Jesus. Look here, John chapter 12. This is where we'll start. Verse 1. Then 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus, who had been dead, Lazarus, who had been dead, whom he had raised from the dead. And there they made him a supper, and Martha served, but Lazarus was one of those who sat at the table with him. And then Mary took a pound of very costly oil of spikenard, anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the oil. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, who would betray him, said, why was this fragrant oil not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? Let me just tell you, that was like a year's wages at the time. That this perfume, it cost that much, and it's been broken and spilled on Jesus. And this he said, not because Judas cared for the poor, but because he was a thief, and he had the money box, and he used to take what was put in it. So Mary broke this jar of perfume, and Judas brought up how much money it could have been sold for, not because he was concerned, but because he was greedy and used to skim money from the top of the money bag. He thought to himself, hey, if they would have sold this, it would have been so much more money. And he thought, I could have lined my pockets. This would have been a good day for Judas. And what's bad is it's one of his fellow disciples who is looking back on the story of Jesus, and he's telling the behavior of Judas. See, life is lived looking forward, but it's learned looking back. And John, after he's seen all of the events unfold, he's learned exactly who Judas was. See, there were signs. This was a sign that something wasn't going right. And they may not have caught on to it at the time. I believe that John is recalling this story, and he goes, you know what? The only reason he even brought that up was because he was just trying to take some money from it. And then I look at Mary for a minute. Mary brings her worship. What is worship? Well, she takes something very costly and she breaks it at the feet of Jesus. She takes what is most valuable to her and she lays it on the altar. When I think about that, I also think of Abraham. He did the same thing. He took Isaac, and when God asked him to sacrifice Isaac on the altar, he was prepared to do it. Why? Because he was taking his most valuable possession and laying it down before the Lord. And he realized that what he had and what had been given to him, if the Lord wanted to take it back, guess what? It was his to have. And Mary's actions echo Mary's allegiance to Christ. And what is this worship that we do here? I hope it's taking our most valuable things and breaking them at the feet of Jesus. Because if you don't take the most valuable things that you have and break them at the feet of Jesus, guess what you'll do with them? You'll put them up on a shelf in your life, and they'll be an idol between you and Jesus. And they'll take more precedence over them than Jesus. Judas' actions reflect his selfishness and his loyalty to himself. The battle of laying down our life, it's always going to be the biggest battle we face in our relationship with the Lord. But when we realize who it is that's giving us that life, we naturally should respond with a willingness to lay it down. And Mary says all that Jesus had done for her, she sees it all and she says, oh. And her natural reaction is unaltered worship. I don't know where you're at with the Lord. I hope that you have a great story of redemption. And I hope in that story you realize the cost that Jesus paid for you. And in that, the natural response for you is worship. It's to take every single thing that I have and to give it back to Him. I've had little and I've had a lot. And you know what? He owes it all. I owe it all to Him. Mary had been forgiven. She had had demons cast out of her. She had lived this life basically as like a prostitute. And now she's laying her life before the Lord as she pours out her perfume. And you know what she's doing? She did it in a room full of men in a time when it wasn't popular for women to take the star of the show. So she walks in right amongst the people murmuring about her, the people talking about, maybe even the people who knew her. And she says, you know what, I'm going to break out this perfume that I've got. It's expensive, it's costly perfume, and I'm going to pour it out on Jesus' feet. And look at this, what it says in 12:3. Then Mary took a pound of very costly oil of spikenard, anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of her oil. What is that? The house is filled with the fragrance of her oil. It's her act of worship permeated the atmosphere that she occupied. This morning as you sang songs and you lifted up your heart to the Lord and you began to say, was it just singing words as almost like a puppet or a performance, or was it that your worship actually permeated the atmosphere that you occupied? In other words, as you sing, something came from your heart that said, Lord, thank you for all that you've done for me. I naturally bring this out of me. I talked to FCA this week, to the Ohatchee baseball team, and I told them, I said, what's on the inside is birthed out through the mouth. So when you talk, I can identify who you are within just a few minutes because of what's coming out has to be coming from somewhere inside. It's your natural response because as you're around, I begin quickly to know who you are because you will tell on yourself. And this morning I'd say, what is the fragrance of your worship? What is the scent of your sacrifice? You know what? There was another smell permeating that room, though. There was the smell of Mary's worship, but there was also the smell of Judas' selfishness. Look at we saw what John says, but I want us to look at what Matthew mentions immediately after the story. He tells this story too. It must have been a pretty powerful story about Mary and her worship offering as she poured it out. But look what Matthew says after it here. This is Matthew chapter 26, starting with verse 14. It says, Then one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priest. This is right after. He's just told the story of the offering. It says, right after this, he says, one of the 12, called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priest and asked, What are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you? So they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver. And from then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. Judas is so blinded by greed that he's made a deal for Jesus' life. I didn't get money off the perfume, so I'm going to go to the people that are ready to take Jesus out. The ones that actually wanted to kill Lazarus too, because he was a sign of the miracles of Jesus. He said, I'm going to go to them and I'm going to ask them, not they're going to come to me and ask me how much I would take, but I'm going to go to them. I'm so driven by greed that I'm making the offensive effort to go out and get it done. I'm going out and I'm saying, hey, what will you give me if I'll give you Jesus' life? See, that's a whole nother level. In John 13, now we're at the Last Supper, and Jesus shares with his disciples. Jesus is about to take the bread. We know when we talk about communion, he takes the bread. He says, this is my body. He takes the wine and he says, this is my blood. The disciple John was there in that room. The one who wrote the book of John, he's there in the room. He reclined against Jesus because he loved him. And in John chapter 13, he recalls the picture for us to see. Look here, John 13. I know I'm jumping around from gospel to gospel here, but if you got it, John 13, verse 18, he says, Jesus says, I'm not referring to all of you. I know those I have chosen, but this is to fulfill this passage of Scripture. He who shared my bread has turned against me. John's telling this story just like you and I are here today. He says, I'm telling you now before it happens so that when it does happen, you will believe that I am who I am. So Jesus is telling this at the Last Supper. He says, very truly I tell you, whoever accepts anyone I send accepts me. And whoever accepts me accepts the one who sent me. And after he had said this, Jesus was troubled in the spirit and testified, very truly I tell you, one of you is going to betray me. His disciples stared at one another at a loss to know which of the one he meant. And one of the disciples whom Jesus loved was reclining next to him and said, Simon Peter motioned to this disciple and said, ask him which one he means. Hey, John, who is Jesus talking about? And leaning back against Jesus, he asked him, Lord, who is it? He's touching Jesus. And he's telling this story. And Jesus answered and he said, it's the one whom I will give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish. And then dipping the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. And as soon as Judas took the bread, what's it say? Satan entered him. So Jesus told him, what you're about to do it quickly. Now we're at a different level. Before, it was compromise. But now Satan enters Judas. Now Satan doesn't have the right. I want you to understand, he doesn't have the right to just come into you and take over when he wants. We're not puppets that he gets to come inside. Like all of a sudden Brett's not going to be walking out to the lobby out there and Satan's just going to decide he wants to take over Brett and he's going to get to take over. That's not how it works. But Judas wasn't always this way. He's left himself open. But before Judas had a devil, you know what he had? Before he had a devil, he had a distraction. And that's where it starts because complete surrender begins with partial compromise. I know what's right, but I want to do this. Partial compromise. Judas was living a life of compromise and of selfishness, and greed was just the fruit of that life. It's what his life naturally produced. Anytime I've talked about fruit, I've told you, fruit is what's naturally produced. So greed is a fruit of this life that Judas is living. So Judas was leaving the door of his life open. He wasn't being guided by the Spirit of God. He wasn't submitted to the lordship of Jesus Christ. So one choice after the next left him exposed, and eventually it left him inhabited. That's the danger of knowing the way and choosing not to walk in it. It's still happening today. Demonic influences all over the place. Some of it has been labeled as mental illness at times. I'm not saying that all mental illness is demonic influence. That's not what I'm saying this morning, so don't take something that I didn't say. But I do think it's easier to label something you don't understand mental illness when you can't put a label on it. I look at some of the stuff in Scripture where there was demonic influence, and I go, I see people doing things like that today. Do you remember the man who had the demons, and he was cutting himself with rocks, and they couldn't chain him up? He'd just break the chains out. See, things are happening like that today, and we would like to excuse them with something else. But the reality is, it's the same demons doing the same thing. And the question here when we're looking at Judas is, are you leaving yourself open to attack? Are you a Christian in name only? See, we live in the South where everybody seems like they're a Christian. I'm a Christian, and then they say a string of words that doesn't sound like anything like Jesus would say. I was at the baseball field yesterday. No line. I was in line at the concession stand. They have a little, I ain't going to say where I was, but they have a little box up above it where the press box is. As I'm standing in line, all of a sudden I hear the foulest language poured out. Multiply F words multiple times, and this was what was coming from above. This guy was mad. See, everybody wants to say they're part of something, but when you look around, you start seeing signs that it doesn't line up. Look here at the disciples. Go to Matthew 12 for me. Matthew captures this teaching from Jesus in the book of Matthew, in chapter 12. I'm jumping back and forth between John and Matthew, but it's the disciples telling firsthand accounts of things Jesus did. Matthew chapter 12, verse 43. When an evil spirit leaves a person, well, that right there tells you that it's real, because Jesus said it. When an evil spirit leaves a person, so that evil spirits come into people and then inhabit people. It goes into the desert seeking rest but finding none. And then it says, I will return to the person that I came from. So it returns and it finds its former home empty, swept, and in order. Well, if that home is full of Jesus, it's not going to be empty. And so when he returns, it may be swept in order, but it'll be occupied. Verse 45, then the spirit finds 7 other spirits more evil than itself, and they all enter the person and live there. And so that person is worse off than before. That will be the experience of this evil generation. So this person got delivered from demons, but then continued down the path that they were taking before they had been set free. So the demons returned and found them cleaned up. And because they were leaving themselves open to compromise and sin, guess what? The demon returned and brought his companions with him. This is what I know. Compromise is costly. If you don't think so, compromise your marriage. Go out and do what you want to. It's going to cost you something. Compromise your children. Guess what? It's going to be, they're going to come through. Things are going to happen. You're going to lose here. When you're away from here, what does your behavior look like? What does your behavior look like? Does it look like Christ? Or does it look like you and whatever pleases you? Like, do you wake up thinking, what do I need to do to make me happy? So you spend a little money. Maybe you chase an addiction of some sort. What does your life look like? Or does it look like Christ? Sure, I know you're probably not building idols and bowing down to them. But wait a second. Maybe you are. Maybe the idol is you, and you're bowing down to what you want more than what Christ wants for your life. And you've become the idol, and you're worshiping at the altar of self. You say, Well, how do I know what Christ wants in my life? How do I know? Well, this is how you know. You read the Bible. You say, oh, is it going to perfectly tell me what? No. But what happens is when you read the Bible, you read it, you begin to seek the Lord, and your obedience to Him all of a sudden will reveal and unlock doors for you. Like when I became a Christian, I didn't know one day in 2016, you're going to become the pastor of Cornerstone Fellowship. Just do whatever you want till then. It's going to come to pass. No, what I did was every day, I was like, well, what can I do today? I'm serving the Lord. Oh, this opportunity opened up for me. I'm going to walk through this door of opportunity. I'm going to do this for this right here time. Sometimes it looked like teaching a Sunday school class. Sometimes it looked like volunteering for a ministry. Sometimes it looked like attending a rally, attending a conference, whatever it was. Sometimes it just looked like getting up and going to work each day, but not compromising what I believe. And guess what God did? He took me to the place that I needed to go to do the things that He wanted me to do. Because what did I say? You just got to get in the boat and He will carry you to the destination. Judas had momentary blindness. Lies of wealth and fortune overtook him. And the devil simply played the same hand against Judas that he had tried to tempt Jesus with in the desert. Go to another gospel now. Go to Luke chapter 4. Luke chapter 4. The devil's playbook is predictable if you understand that he's the one playing the cards here. Look here. Luke chapter 4. And the devil, he takes Jesus up on this mountain and he showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time and said to him, to you I will give all this authority and all their glory, for it has been delivered me, and I will give it to whom I will. If you then will worship me, it'll all be yours. And Jesus answered him, it's written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and Him only shall you serve. Judas, here's 30 pieces of silver if you'll just turn over Jesus to me. Judas, just take a little money off the top of the bag. It's yours to take. Nobody's looking. Nobody's watching. Maybe you got a situation at your work right now where nobody's looking. They don't know if I'm doing right or wrong. They don't know if I'm taking what's not mine. I'll just take a little bit. It's not going to make any difference. And the whole time, compromise is opening the door. The devil creates a hunger inside of Judas for riches and shows itself in the room when Judas begins questioning Mary's offering. See, it started before that because now when we first see it come to pass, Mary's in there with her offering and Judas is worried about the money all of a sudden. He's so steeped in selfishness that he thought he should go after all he could obtain. Then after that moment with Mary, he goes and he betrays Jesus. And it was in the end that he traded Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. And what's bad is Judas probably started off eager to follow Jesus. He started off right. I don't think from the beginning Judas' plan was to fail. I think he set off with the idea of following and learning from the rabbi. But at some point his focus shifted from Jesus to him. And that happens in the church a lot. People get thinking that they're doing something so great that they need the attention, that they need the focus, or they start focusing on what they need and not what Jesus wants to do in their life. That's the point we all have to face in our walk with Jesus. Our eyes must stay on Him and not fame, fortune, or anything else that we could attain at the cost of taking our eyes off of Him. And this is what I know. You can't behold the beauty of something if you quit looking at it. Judas quit looking at Jesus. And Judas started looking at Him. How can you behold something if you turn away from it? Romans 6:23 talks about for the wages of sin is death. That means living a life of sin leads to death, and not just death physically, but death spiritually. And Judas goes and makes a deal for 30 pieces of silver for the life of Jesus. And Jesus is praying in the garden after the Last Supper, and then Judas shows up with a crowd. Look here in Matthew chapter 26. Matthew 26:47. Just then, while Jesus was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12 apostles, arrived, and a large crowd carrying swords and clubs was with him. They were from the chief priests and leaders of the people. Now the traitor had given them a signal. He said, the one I kiss is the man you want. Arrest him. And then Judas quickly stepped up to Jesus and said, hello, Rabbi, and kissed him. And Jesus said to him, friend, why are you here? And then some men came forward and they took hold of Jesus and they arrested him. Judas betrays Jesus with a kiss. He used something intimate to accomplish something horrific. It was an intimate insurrection. Judas used something meant to be a friendly greeting as a way to entrap Jesus and identify him to those who would ultimately lead him to the cross. And this is something that I know too, is the wounds of a friend have to be even that much more heartbreaking to Jesus. The betrayal was an inside job from someone who had spent nights learning at the feet of Jesus, a man who had spent nights sleeping amongst the closest of Jesus' disciples. So after sin had accomplished its desire with Judas, you know what happens? This is what sin does. It leaves him exposed, it leaves him open, and it leaves him with nothing, because what Judas doesn't realize is all of the time that he's been serving sin, it's been picking his pocket. And now he doesn't have Jesus, and he doesn't have the joys of sin, so he just has death. And this is what it says about the death of Judas. Look here, Matthew 27, it says, early in the morning, all the chief priests and the leaders of the people decided to execute Jesus. And they tied him up and they led him away and handed over to Pilate, the governor. And then Judas' eyes were opened because the devil's plan was accomplished. Then Judas, who had betrayed Jesus, regretted what had happened when he saw that Jesus was condemned. And he brought the 30 silver coins back to the chief priests and leaders. And he said, I've sinned by betraying an innocent man. And they replied, what do we care? That's your problem. So they threw the money into the temple. So he threw the money in the temple, and he went and he hanged himself. See, sin was done with him. It had accomplished what it had set out to do. It killed Jesus. Jesus is on his way to the cross. And now all of a sudden Judas is feeling the effects of the decisions he made. Look, it even tells it a little bit further in Acts chapter 1. They're talking about replacing the disciples. And Peter stands up and he says, brothers, what the Holy Spirit predicted through David in Scripture about Judas had come true. Judas led the men to arrest Jesus. He had been one of us and had been given an active role in this ministry. And with the money he received from the wrong he had done, he bought a piece of land where he fell headfirst to his death. That means he hung himself, and his body split open, and all his internal organs came out. This is a perfect picture of what the devil wants to do with your life. He wants to pickpocket you while you're focused on other things. Sin will take you further than you want to go. It'll cost you more than you want to pay, and it'll keep you longer than you want to stay. And what's bad before that? It's fun. It seems like a good thing. But then all of a sudden you're doing things that you used to wouldn't do. All of a sudden it's writing checks that you can't cash. All of a sudden it's got you and you can't get away from it. I don't believe Judas began with a desire to betray Jesus until death. But momentum began to build with each selfish decision Judas made. And so many people come in through these doors and they give me a smile and a handshake. I think over the last 9 years, I've seen a lot of them. But when they leave here, they have no intention of living a life for Jesus. They don't change their behavior. They've never really given their heart to Jesus. You know, this morning, I'm really not trying to be mean. I'm just trying to identify who you are. I'm trying to be accurate. Because I get let down when I think I've met a disciple and find out I've just met a deceiver. Judas was one of 12, and he was a deceiver, not a disciple. What does that tell me about the people that come in and out of my life? Sure, I trust them all. I let them all into my life. We expose ourselves to everybody, and we welcome them in, and we say, come on in. We give love to everyone. And it's so sad how many people have walked out. I thought about this morning, people I've shared life group with, people that I've shared ministry with over the years that don't live for the Lord today, that probably might even wish harm to us because they're so far away from the Lord. We've stayed in the same place. We're still serving in the same places. We're still here if they want to come back. But what happens is that people get caught into deception and they get into living for themselves. And then it takes them down roads that they don't want to go down and keeps them longer than they want to stay. And it's hard. It's a hard break when you find out that the guy working next to you is actually working against you. I've trusted people who were really against me. I've seen people come to the church, but they were faking it at best. And for the other disciples, they were sharing food with Judas, and all the time Judas was plotting. They were given a portion of what they had so that he could eat. They were giving their best, and he was working against them. As Christians, we say we don't treat people based on how they treat us. But right at the end, before Jesus goes to the cross, Judas, he's literally probably hiding the 30 pieces of silver that he's been paid for the betrayal of Jesus. And Jesus knew in his heart the plans that Judas had. But in the end, when they're in the Last Supper, you know what Jesus does? He gets down and washes his feet. Before he exposed him, he could have exposed him at the beginning. He could have said, Judas is a rotten thief. He has betrayed me. Go out and do what you got to do. Everybody here attacked Judas. Everybody beat him up on his way out. He could have done whatever he wanted to do, but he didn't. You know what he said? He said, okay. And he takes off his towel and he gets down. And here's the guy who's betrayed him. Here's the guy who's turned him over. Here's the guy that's ultimately going to cause him to go to the cross, the greatest physical pain that he's going to endure on the earth, because he's going to have his very own Father turn his back on him because the sin of the world is going to be laid upon Jesus. Not to mention the beating that has caused him not to even look like himself anymore, where his bones are probably exposed from the beating that's incurred. And here's the guy that has literally cashed it in on him. The guy that he shared food with, the guy that he's probably held hands with, the guy he's prayed for, the guy he's prayed over. And he says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm not going to get even. I'm going to serve him. Jesus washed the feet of his enemy. Jesus washed the feet of the fake. And you know what Judas' problems were? They were Judas's problems. They weren't Jesus's. And a lot of people want to blame Jesus for everything, when the problems many of us have in our life are directly related to the choices that we make. And Judas made choices. And Judas' compromise was costly. And it led him down paths he did not intend to go. And he never enjoyed it. He never enjoyed the money that he got for betraying Jesus. Money's not everything. Is there anyone here this morning that deep down you say, I'm just a fake? I'm not trying to call anybody out this morning. I'm just trying to bring light to situations. You say, deep down I'm just a fake. If the things I was doing in private were exposed, people would see the real me. I would say, don't be a Judas. And let your compromise lead you down a path of no return. If you're here this morning, it's because you were supposed to hear this word, whether it applies to you or it applies something that you can glean from it. But what I know is it's saying, hey, here is an opportunity for you not to let this be the end of you. Judas followed this path all the way to the point of him having to hang himself in his own regret and his own shame. What this morning is for you, it's an intersection for you to decide which way you want to go. Romans 10:13 tells us this. It says, everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. You know what? You have an opportunity this morning to call on the name of the Lord. You can drop the act and you can come to Jesus. You know what? Because he's still wanting to know you. Judas had an opportunity at the Last Supper. Jesus is down washing his feet, and Judas could have said, Jesus, I've made a great mistake. I'm so sorry for my actions. I'm so sorry for what I've done. Please receive. And I believe that Jesus would have took him right back in. Why? Because he has so many times for other people. Jesus washed Judas' feet, and he loved him knowing what he was doing. And let me tell you, there is nothing that you've done that he's not loving you right now. Worship team, would you come? Maybe you've experienced some things like me lately where it's like you don't know if you're on the edge of falling into breakdown or falling into breakthrough. But I guarantee you that God is in the middle of it. And you know what? You don't have to keep walking, hiding from the things that you've been doing. You can come clean. You can come to Christ. And you know what? He can work a great story of your life. There's been a lot of people throughout generations who did horrible, nasty things. But at some point they met Christ and it changed everything. Just look at the Apostle Paul. I mean, he's killing Christians. And then in a moment, all of a sudden, he's trying to save them, trying to make more of them. He's doing something terribly awful. And then all of a sudden redemption happens and he's doing something great. And he's remembered for his greatness. He's not so much remembered for all of the terrible things that he did. He was at the stoning of Stephen. They said that they laid the coats at the feet of a young man named Saul. That is the Apostle Paul. At the stoning of Stephen, the first martyr we see in the Bible. And Paul is there, but it's before he's been redeemed. But we're not telling that story so much as we're telling all of the other stories about how most of the New Testament is written by him. Let's stand together this morning. Do not be deceived. This word, this moment was meant to shine light on some things. How about this? Don't even worry about how you're going to get over the things that you've been doing. Just lay them at the feet of Jesus. And let him worry about it. It's not yours to worry about. Altar is open as they sing this morning. If you say, man, the Lord's tugging at my heart, be obedient to that this morning.